If you enjoy cinematic history stories like this, stories where a single decision changes everything, please hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel a lot, and it tells me to make more episodes like this. Winter had tightened its grip on the rebellion, the kind of winter that doesn't just freeze rivers, but freezes hope. The kind that turns roads into traps, tents into coffins, and confidence into something you whisper about rather than believe. By late December 1776, victory didn't feel close, it felt impossible. The American cause had been pushed to the edge of extinction. The army was worn down by cold, rain, snow, and storm. Men were exhausted from marching and from hunger. They lacked shoes, blankets, even the basic certainty that their service would matter. Enlistments were ending. Desertion was no longer a shameful rumor. It was an hourly reality. The grand political language of independence sounded noble in warm rooms, but out here, in the raw wind, nobility didn't stop frostbite from taking fingers or feet. And yet, after the surprise at Trenton, there was no rest. The victors, if they could even be called that in their condition, snatched what refreshment they could from captured stores. Then, still burdened by fatigue, still half blind from sleet, they set out again. They had nearly 1,000 prisoners to manage. They had no sleep worth naming. They marched under a northeast wind that drove sleet like needles into skin. At the ferry, they crossed back through the Delaware's misery, passing another terrible night in the boatwork and ice. Not all of them made it. One half of the soldiers under Sterling were disabled by the ordeal, and 2 men froze to death. That was the texture of this campaign. Success measured in minutes of combat, paid for in nights that killed quietly. And while the men suffered, the political world tried to understand what the victory meant. The revolution had always depended on more than gunfire. It depended on belief, inside the colonies and far beyond them. Foreign courts watched carefully, waiting to see if this rebellion was an inconvenience or a nation being born. Before Trenton, the story looked grim. The British seemed unstoppable. If the rebellion collapsed, there would be no alliance, no loans, no legitimacy, just punishment. Now, with the shock at Trenton spreading through the colonies, Congress grasped at the moment. They wanted foreign courts to understand something. This was not a dying cause. This was a people who meant to remain independent at all events. So plans and proposals began to move. Commerce, treaties, diplomacy, words that sound soft compared to muskets, were treated as weapons of their own. Offers were discussed for Prussia, for Vienna, for Tuscany. The aim was not simply friendship, but strategy, preventing Russian or German troops from serving against the United States. And beyond prevention, there was a bigger dream drawn in ink, an offensive alliance with France and Spain against Great Britain. Because the United States, if it was to exist, needed more than courage. It needed time, money, powder, steel, and friends. Yet beneath all that diplomacy, there was another truth that refused to go away. Independence could only be secured by an army. Not a mob, not a seasonal gathering, an army.
And so, in Congress, urgent letters were read. Letters from Washington and from Greene, letters that carried not drama, but necessity. The crisis required decisions. Congress considered it with the sober awareness that the next mistake might be fatal. And, placing what they called perfect reliance on Washington's wisdom, vigor, and uprightness, they resolved to do what the moment demanded. They moved to strengthen him. They authorized new battalions, new regiments, new corps. They gave permission to raise, organize, and officer forces under the authority of the United States and to fill vacancies. They gave power that in another time would have frightened them. They granted authority in ways that made enemies mutter words like dictator, dictator of America, as if the colonies had traded one tyrant for another. But those who were freezing in the field knew the difference between authority and tyranny. Authority was what allowed you to act before the enemy crushed you. And Washington understood the strange weight of it. He recognized the unusual trust that had been placed in him. He understood what it meant when civil power, in desperation, leaned on military power. He spoke with a kind of disciplined humility, that the sword was the last resort for preserving liberties, and that he would lay it aside when those liberties were established. But he also knew something harsher. Liberty would not survive without reforms, without discipline, without an army capable of staying in the field when winter itself tried to kill it. So Washington went to work. He faced practical problems so constant they became a second enemy. Money was short, supplies were short, men were short, the public credit was exhausted, paymasters had empty hands. The army, in its bones, was still a collection of exhausted citizens with families and farms calling them home. And still the British were there, still strong, still professional, still backed by the world's greatest naval power. They were not panicking, they were adjusting. Because Trenton had not ended the war, it had simply proved that the war could still be won. In the days that followed, forces moved like pieces in a storm. Cadwallader at Bristol heard of Washington at Trenton and took measures to cross into New Jersey. Hitchcock's men struggled with shortages, shoes, stockings, breeches, things so small on paper and so decisive in snow. Donop, hearing of Rall's defeat, retreated in haste by way of Crosswicks and Allentown toward Princeton, abandoning stores, leaving sick and wounded behind, and pulling back to positions that could be held. Every movement was shaped by weather, fatigue, and fear. Washington, on the 27th, communicated plans and intentions with urgency. He wrote to collect troops at Morristown. He called on the militia of Jersey, asking for help and insisting on merit-based appointments, because he knew desperation can rot an army from within if command becomes political theater. He aimed to build substance. On the 29th, the army was reduced nearly to half its effective numbers by fatigue and by the late attack at Trenton and by the endless friction of campaign. Yet even then, Washington crossed again, and he announced to Congress his purpose: to pursue the enemy and beat up more of their quarters, and, most important, to adopt such measures as the exigency of affairs required and the situation would justify. He wasn't speaking like a man who wanted merely to survive.
He was speaking like a man who wanted to press. Then, on the 30th, he repaired to Trenton, and to the officer commanding at Morristown, he wrote words that sound simple until you picture the ice. "Be in readiness to cooperate with me." Part of his troops and artillery were impeded by ice and could not get over until the next day. The term of enlistment of the Eastern regiments came to an end. Veteran soldiers stood at the edge of their obligation, ready to step out of the ranks and walk home. This is where revolutions die, not in a single battle, but in the silent moment when men decide it's over and leave. Washington faced them, and he appealed to them directly, urgently, like a man bargaining with the future. Pennsylvania had offered them conditions if they would serve 6 weeks longer. With one voice, they gave their word to remain. Not because their feet were warm, because hope after Trenton could be felt again. But even hope didn't print money. The paymaster was out of money. The public credit was exhausted. Washington pledged his own fortune. Officers did the same. It wasn't symbolic, it was survival. It was leaders trying to hold the line with personal sacrifice because the institutions were still too weak to carry their own weight. Meanwhile, the British were reorganizing. Cornwallis was moving, bringing with him the flower of the British Army, numbers that dwarfed what Washington could put in the field. The air was warm and moist for a time, and the roads were soft, slowing heavy marches, delaying columns, shaping the timing of contact. And as January 1777 arrived, the struggle shifted into a new chapter, Assunpink and Princeton, because a single victory does not end a war, it only changes the questions. Now the question was not, can we strike? It was, can we stand? On the 2nd of January, Cornwallis advanced upon the Americans with seasoned troops and confidence. Skirmishers and riflemen disputed every step of the British progress. At the Shabbaconk Creek, troops hidden in the woods on the flanks harassed the advance for 2 hours. It was the kind of fighting that doesn't show well in paintings: ambushes, smoke, quick retreats, men dropping in snow, officers shouting in confusion. But it mattered because it bought time. On the hill less than a mile above Trenton, the British were confronted by American musketeers and field pieces, handled with skill, supported by a detachment under Greene. It was not a grand army standing in perfect lines. It was an army learning, adapting, surviving. Washington took command of the rear. Cornwallis sought to outflank him. Washington detained the British until his own troops gained time to plant cannon beyond the rivulet of Assunpink. As the enemy advanced, they were worried by musketry from houses and barns. They attempted to force the bridge and were repulsed. Again and again they pressed. Again and again they were turned back. The Americans had all safely passed over. The Assunpink could not be forded without a battle, and beyond it stood the main body of the American army, silent in their ranks, protected by batteries. Late in the day, Simcoe advised a crossing above. Others feared that if Cornwallis tried again and failed, Washington might escape before morning. But the sun was nearly down. The night threatened to be foggy and dark. British troops were worn out with skirmishes and long marches over heavy roads, and so they waited. There is a particular kind of confidence that can only be born from seeing your enemy trapped. British pickets pushed forward along the Assunpink. They watched the American position. The general officers took their repose. The British army slept by their fires on the hill above Trenton, convinced that the rebels were finally pinned and would be crushed at dawn. That assumption, comfortable, logical, deadly, was the crack Washington intended to exploit, because he knew something the British did not fully appreciate. He knew the byways, he knew the roads, and he knew that if he sat still, he would be destroyed. He therefore followed a plan that had existed in germ from the moment he decided to re-enter New Jersey. Prepare to turn the left of Cornwallis, overwhelm the party at Princeton, and push on, if possible, to Brunswick, or at least move toward Morristown, creating danger where the British assumed there would be none. When it became dark, he ordered the baggage to be removed noiselessly to Burlington. No drums, no shouting, no display.
Just the quiet movement of a desperate army trying to slip away from an enemy that believed it had already won. Soon after midnight, Washington marched his army round the head of the creek into the Princeton road. The wind veered to the northwest. The weather suddenly became cold. The road, lately difficult for artillery, was soon frozen hard. Guards were left to replenish the American campfires, which flamed along the Assunpink for more than half a mile. A simple trick, fires left burning in place so that British eyes watching from the hills would see what they expected, a rebel camp settled down for the night, waiting to be destroyed. It worked. The drowsy night watch suspected nothing. At sunrise, Washington arrived in the southeast outskirts of Princeton. His main body wheeled to the right by a back road toward the colleges. Mercer was detached toward the west with a few hundred men to break down the bridge over Stony Brook on the main road to Trenton. But 2 British regiments were already on the move. They were marching to join Cornwallis, the 17th with 3 companies of horse under Mallwood, more than a mile in advance of the 55th. They had already passed Stony Brook. When Smallwood discovered a small body of Americans in his rear, apparently not larger than his own, he recrossed the rivulet, formed a junction with part of the 55th, and moved to engage Mercer. The parties were nearly equal. Each had 2 pieces of artillery, but the English were fresh from undisturbed repose, while the Americans were suffering from a night march of 18 miles. That difference, sleep versus no sleep, can decide nations. Both parties moved toward high ground. A heavy discharge from English artillery was returned by American fire. After a brisk cannonade, the Americans climbed over a fence to confront the British. They were the first to use their guns. Smallwood's infantry returned the volley, then charged with bayonets. Many Americans, riflemen without bayonets, gave way. They abandoned their cannon. Their officers, loath to fly, were left in the rear, endeavoring to call back the fugitives. General Mercer was wounded, knocked down, and then stabbed many times. It was brutal, close, personal, and for a moment it looked like the night march had brought Washington's army into disaster. Then Washington came up, drawn by the sound of cannon, moving in to intercept the main body of the British 55th Regiment. He understood what was happening in a glance: a line breaking, men retreating, an enemy charging with steel, panic spreading like fire through dry grass. Washington rode forward into less than 30 yards of the British and reined in his horse with its head toward the enemy. At the same moment, both parties gave a volley. Smoke swallowed the scene. In that heartbeat, the kind of heartbeat where a country can be born or die, Washington remained untouched. He had ridden within killing distance to animate his troops by example, and it worked. The British, seeing the rebels rally, began to turn their left, fled over fields and fences toward Stony Brook. The action, from the first contact with Mercer, did not last more than 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That is how long it took for chaos to become victory. Washington on the battleground took Hitchcock by the hand and thanked him for his service. Smallwood left 2 brass field pieces, which for want of horses the Americans could not carry off. The British were chased for 3 or 4 miles. The 55th, after resisting gallantly, retreated with the 40th to the college, and when pieces of artillery were brought up, escaped across the fields into a back road toward Brunswick. The British losses that day were heavy: killed, wounded, prisoners. The American loss was small, except of officers. At Trenton, on the return of day, the generals were astonished not to see the American army. The noise of cannon at Princeton revealed whither it had gone. In consternation for the safety of the magazines at Brunswick, Cornwallis roused his army and began a swift pursuit. His advanced party from Maidenhead reached Princeton just as the town was left by the American rear. The movements were tight, fast, and dangerous. 2 armies moving through winter roads, separated by hours, each trying to reach the places that would decide the next month of war. But Washington had accomplished what he needed to accomplish. He had escaped the trap at Assunpink. He had struck at Princeton. He had forced the British to react rather than command the pace. And in war, forcing the enemy to react is often the beginning of victory.
Yet the campaign did not become easy. It remained hungry, cold, and uncertain. The army was still small, still fragile. Washington's men were often barefoot. They were exhausted from 2 days and a night of constant movement, almost without refreshment. The British army of Cornwallis was close behind. After breaking up the bridge at Kingston over the Millstone River, Washington made for the Highlands and halted for the night at Somerset Courthouse. There, in the woods, worn-out men sank down on frozen ground and fell asleep. This is another form of heroism, not charging, not shouting, but simply continuing. The example and orders of Washington roused the people around him. The next days saw skirmishes and captures, militia action, prisons taken, enemy baggage seized, towns shifted, outposts adjusted, and the British found that even victory could become a mockery if the country would not submit. In New Jersey, the tide began to turn. Washington made his headquarters at Morristown, and the surrounding villages provided shelter. The largest encampment was in Spring Valley, on the southern slope of Madison Hill. The outposts extended close to Amboy, and though there was but the phantom of an army, the British in New Jersey were confined to Brunswick, Amboy, and Paulus Hook, boxed in by a force that was not massive, but was persistent, watchful, and increasingly confident. The campaign's result was auspicious for Britain's enemies. The invaders had acquired only islands that touched New York Harbor and a few advanced outposts. Whenever they passed beyond their straitened quarters, they met resistance. They were wasted by incessant alarms. Their forage and provisions were purchased at the price of blood. And this was not simply a military shift. It was psychological. It was the restoration of belief. It was the proof that Washington could not only endure, but outthink and outmaneuver an opponent with more men, more money, and more certainty. The story spread, and with it came the arguments that would echo in Congress and in foreign capitals. Washington's conduct and enterprise drew praise, even from cautious observers. Those who had doubted whether the rebellion could be sustained began to speak differently. They spoke of character. They spoke of resilience. They spoke of a man who, through misfortune, rose higher. And among the voices describing Washington's rise, one sentiment stands out, that misfortunes were the element in which he shone, that they were the groundwork on which his picture appeared to the greatest advantage, that he rose superior to them all, and that they served as foils to his fortitude and stimulants to bring into view great qualities which modesty kept concealed. The war was not over. It would not be over for years, but something decisive had happened in the snow and sleet of New Jersey. The revolution had passed through a narrow gate. From the outside, it might look like a handful of marches and 2 or 3 sharp fights. From the inside, from the point of view of the half-frozen soldier, the sleepless officer, the commander calculating by candlelight, it was a demonstration that the cause could survive its worst season. And that matters because most causes don't die when they are disproven. They die when people stop believing. Trenton lit a spark. Assunpink kept it alive. Princeton made it visible to the world. And when the world sees a cause that refuses to die, it begins to treat it differently. It begins to think in terms of alliances, loans, treaties, futures. That's how rebellions become countries. Not in a single triumphant parade, but in the stubborn refusal to collapse when collapse seems inevitable. If you want more stories like this, true history told with cinematic detail, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. More episodes are coming, and the next one gets even darker before the dawn breaks.